Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of East Turkestan podcast program organized by Center for East Turkestan National Interest. I am Rukiye Turduş, director and a researcher at Center for East Turkestan National Interest. Today, we have very important and honorable guest, Dr. Charles Burton, to talk about recent relations with Canada and China. Dr. Burton is a senior fellow at Synopsys and a former diplomat at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. He has written extensively on Chinese policies and the Canada-China relations, and he prepared strategic reports on China's ties with Western and the developing countries. Dr. Burton is widely recognized as a leading expert on Chinese politics, Canada-China relations, and human rights. He also advises Center for East Turkestan National Interests. Hello, Dr. Burton. Welcome to our podcast program. Very nice to see you today.
It's great to be here with you. It's an honor for me to speak to the East Turkestan friends.
We have a lot to talk about the Canada-China relations and recent development in general, but I'll ask some specific questions today. As you know, David Morrison, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at Global Affairs Canada, gives speech at Chinese National Day celebration in Ottawa, September 26, and he congratulated China on its National Day. But his speech was not published, so we don't know what exactly he said, and I'm sure my audience is curious too. So if it's okay, could you kindly share a very brief overview about his speech and what was the intended diplomatic signal behind his speech?
Yeah, that's a very significant question. We do have a recording of the speech, so we know exactly what he said at the Chinese embassy, and it does indicate a regrettable shift in Canada's relations with China. The Chinese ambassador at that event said that whenever both sides stick to the principle of right perception, mutual respect, seeking common ground while putting aside differences and mutual benefit, the bilateral relations will move forward smooth and achieve fruitful outcomes. Whenever the preceding code is not followed, bilateral relations will take a blow or even derail. So there's some degree of threat in that. Then he said that seeking common ground while setting aside difference is the standard formula really for China, requiring that Canada not engage with China on human rights, espionage, interference in Canadian democracy, or China's suppression of dissent in Hong Kong, the military threat to Taiwan, and expansionist claims in the South China Sea in exchange for China responding increased access to the Chinese market for Canadian commodities. And that, of course, also includes that China does not want Canada to engage with China on the Uyghur issue. So it seems that in response to this, Mr. Morrison is prepared to accept the Chinese formula, which for those of the listeners who understand the Mandarin language is 求同存异, which means, setting aside differences and seeking common ground. And he said that Mr. Carney would concur with what the Chinese ambassador had said in his speech, and that Mr. Carney has made very clear, Mr. Morrison said, his desire to recalibrate Canada-China relations and advance our bilateral ties in a pragmatic and constructive manner. So it appears that in the interest of a Chinese promise of more access to the Chinese market for Canadian commodities. So I think that it indicates that the Canadian government will not be attempting to bring our concerns over China's violations of international law, and particularly, the genocide in the Uyghur regions as part of the relationship. So we're essentially giving tacit consent. Canada's giving tacit consent to China for these egregious violations of international law and of course the rights of humanity. Um, and we're seeing other indications of this. I mean, Mr. Carney was really the only Western advanced democratic country leader not to raise the issue of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. And the government has not acted on the June 2024 law, Bill C-70, which requires the appointment of a foreign influence commissioner and the establishment of a foreign influence registry so that there can be some transparency on people influential in the policy process who have a conflict of interest because they receive benefits from a foreign state. So it's not looking at all good, frankly. And Minister Anand, our foreign minister, is expected to go to Beijing in the next few weeks to consolidate this relationship. And we expect Mr. Carney to have an opportunity to speak directly with the Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping later in the fall. So I'm really despairing about this shift in policy and the gross abandonment of Canadian values and the security and sovereignty concerns that China poses to Canada and to humanity as a whole, and of course, in particular, to the Uyghur people who are living within the boundaries of the People's Republic of China.
Exactly. That's very disappointing. I'm interested in the Chinese ambassador's words he used in his speech. Usually Chinese officials speak of a correct perception, for example. What do they actually mean? Isn't this often a China's way of deflecting or dismissing legitimate criticism by framing this criticism as misperceiving China or misunderstanding China? Isn't that?
Yes, I mean, they certainly don't want us to say that there's anything that the Chinese regime does that is not consistent with international law and a productive contribution to global peace and prosperity. I mean, the fact that I was sanctioned by the Chinese regime for my own participation in promoting the Uyghur cause is indicative that they're simply not prepared to even discuss these matters or allow them to be subject to debate. So the fact that the Chinese government doesn't even want to engage with any countries on our concerns over the genocide is particularly concerning. And then the use of economic leverage to try and enforce this silence and tacit consent for Chinese regime behavior is particularly concerning to me as well. And I can only think that Canada's desire to focus entirely on promoting Canadian prosperity through trade with China will empower other nations to adopt a similar approach of abandoning concerns over security and human rights, Chinese espionage, territorial expansion, and of course the attempt to assimilate and eliminate other civilizational traditions like the Uyghurs, like the Tibetans, like the Mongolians, who are held by people who are currently living within the current borders of the People's Republic of China as recognized by Canada and the UN.
Yeah, they always say it, like this Chinese ambassador said, put aside the differences, those kind of words they always use. What if the differences become too large to set aside in relationship Canada and China? Canada's democratic country and China's autocratic country. What are the boundaries of mutual benefit right now?
You know, the Canadian Parliament in a unanimous vote declared that the Chinese government's policies towards the Uyghurs amount to genocide. So, I mean, if we're prepared to tolerate genocide, then it seems that there are no boundaries
Yeah.
to our desire to increase our trade with China and eliminate the coercive tariffs that China's imposed on agricultural commodities like Canadian canola. I mean, these are quite significant. There are 40,000 farmers in the West who produce the canola. The total production of canola amounts to about 12 billion, equivalent to 12 billion Canadian dollars a year, of which last year we sold about 5 billion of that to China alone. So the devastating effect on the livelihood of completely innocent canola farmers by China's unjustified actions is significant, and apparently our government is prepared to give into that in the interests of protecting the Canadian economy, but at the abandonment of our commitment to uh, the just global order based on the principles of the United Nations, which include the Anti-Genocide Convention and our civil and political rights uh, covenants that Canada signed on to very early in the period of the establishment of the United Nations, and which are articulated well in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Do you think the recent global pressures, right, in international law and against the genocide and what's happening in East Turkestan for Uyghurs and supply chain disruptions and the geopolitical competitions between US and China and other human rights concerns also in Tibet and Hong Kong, those all of them pushing Canada and China come closer together, or like pulling them the different directions? The Canadian government is ignoring our values and international law and abandoning principles, so it's pushed Canada and the China come together. Could you explain about that a little bit
Well,
more?
certainly that's the way that the Chinese want to depict it. You know, Donald Trump's um, flouting of the norms of the World Trade Organization through the imposition of these tariffs and his uncertain commitment to promotion and protection of democracy in Ukraine, for example, is causing a lot of concern in the countries that, on the one hand, are suffering economically because of Mr. Trump's erratic um, decisions on tariffs and violating long existing trade agreements, and also a concern about his commitment to the defense of democratic countries, particularly those that face the threat from China, like Taiwan or South Korea or the countries of the or bordering on the South China Sea, like the Philippines, Vietnam, and so on. So China's depicting itself as a country that respects the norms of the United Nations and the WTO, and will respect pre-existing trade agreements.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a pattern on the part of China to take advantage of the erratic nature of Mr. Trump's foreign policy to try and tip the balance in countries that are have been trying to have a path between the United States and China. So, and providing incentives to do so. So I think that from that point of view, it has been stimulated by Donald Trump, but um, you know, China is not actually committed to the principles of the WTO, as we can see continuously with China's arbitrary imposition of tariffs or non-tariff barriers through claiming phytosanitary concerns over, say, the canola, something like that, saying our canola cannot be brought into China because of infiltration of mold and bugs in the dockage, the non seed part, which was what they did when they were trying to pressure us to not comply with the extradition request of the United States with regard to the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou back in 2019. So, and China certainly does not respect the norms of the United Nations, or they wouldn't be engaging in genocide in the Uyghur areas. So, these claims by China are completely false, but designed to curry favor and strengthen elements in those countries that have economic benefit from engaging with China. So right now, the Canada-China Business Council, which wants us to increase our economic engagement in China, regardless of these other very serious non-trade concerns, is having the upper hand. And I think we're seeing some polling that suggests that Canadians are becoming more anti-American and less anti-China than they were before, because of the perception, which I think is a false perception, that that getting more access to the Chinese market will mitigate the economic negative consequences of the U.S. tariffs. But the bottom line is that our current external commodities trade to China is only about 4% of our foreign trade, and it's unlikely that that's going to increase significantly, particularly as the Chinese economy itself is not doing well. So these promises are false promises, but they're having the effect of dampening Canada's engagement to the extent that we can to stand for human rights in the Uyghur regions, and as you say, in Hong Kong, and standing for the democracy in Taiwan against a potential annexation by the People's Republic of China. So these are very dark times, but it's clearly wrong for our government to abandon our commitment to Canadian values with regard to East Turkestan, simply because of some promise of economic relief for prairie farmers or others, the auto sector, who are negatively impacted by U.S. and Chinese economic pressure.
With its the Canada's current diplomatic posture toward the China, as you just explained it, how does Canada balance its relationship with other global partners, for example, U.S. and Europe, and how they're going to balance their relationship with their allies?
It is a question of us getting together. I mean, China has signed some agreements with Australia to increase the exports of Australian canola to China because of the Chinese action to ban our product from freely entering that market. Well, really, the Australians should not be doing that, because it's simply enabling China to engage in economic leverage against Canada. So we ought to be standing more firmly together in a united way against Chinese economic leverage designed to further its geopolitical expansionism and its gross violations of the norms of human rights and international law, and these, we should be working together. It should be that we collaborate more closely with like-minded allies in Europe. If we can't work with the United States, there's still a large number of countries, particularly those, say, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in Europe and Japan and Korea and the Philippines, all of whom, like us, face a very serious threat to our security and sovereignty from the People's Republic of China, and ongoing hybrid war, espionage, transfer of dual-use military technologies to the Chinese state. So we should come up with a coordinated approach to have strength in numbers and not allow the Chinese regime to divide and conquer us by offering economic incentives to countries that China feels are collaborating with China's overall geostrategic program in compensation for punishing those countries that are standing up against China.
Okay, from your perspective, what lessons can be drawn from the past relationship with Canada, China? For example, to Michael's case and controversies around the foreign agents, those kind of issues that apply now?
Well, I think certainly, we learned from the arbitrary hostage taking of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver, who were subject to really conditions amounting to torture under UN norms, the use of the tiger chair, the sleep deprivation, so much of the conditions were in violation of international law, and they weren't actually guilty of any kind of charge. Neither of those gentlemen was involved in espionage or any kind of violation of any sort of law, and they were held for 3 years solely for the purpose of pressuring the Canadian government to release Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of the Huawei company. It certainly gives you a sense of the true nature of the regime and the danger to Canadians who may go to China and engage in business and find that the Chinese regime is not prepared to fulfill the contracts and may lay arbitrary charges against them or not allow them to leave until they transfer their technologies to the Chinese state, that kind of thing. So, I mean, that's been quite instructive. I think in terms of the foreign influence, there was a significant leaks of documents to the Globe and Mail newspaper, Global News, the independent journalist Sam Cooper, which were largely intelligence assessments from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat of the Privy Council Office, highlighting to government egregious violations of diplomatic practice on the part of Chinese diplomats in Canada and their proxies run through the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. Two commissions were held, in effect, one by David Johnston, a former Governor General closely associated with the government, and then the 8-month study by Justice Marie-Louise Ogg, who called many witnesses and had access to some, but not all, of the secret documents relating to this matter. Unfortunately, the recommendations of the Ogg Commission have not been carried out, and the legislation that the government enacted prior to the release of the Ogg Commission report, Bill C-70, the bill countering foreign influence and interference in the Canadian democracy, have not been implemented. And so it seems that the government, while receiving these reports that suggest that the government was not acting properly on the concerns of our security and intelligence agents with regard to Chinese violations of international law and behavior not compatible with their diplomatic status on the part of Chinese diplomats, we haven't taken really any action except expelling one agent of the Ministry of State Security who, it turned out through the leak of documents, was involved in attempting to intimidate the family of the Conservative Party foreign affairs critic Michael Chong, who has a family in Hong Kong. So, we know that there are a large cohort of these diplomats that are involved specifically in espionage, influence operations, the co-optation of Canadian policy-making elite, and menacing and harassing critics of the regime in Canada. But our government has not been willing to expel those diplomats and declare them persona non grata, or to engage in legal proceedings against people who don't have diplomatic status, who have been acting as agents of the Chinese regime. And as I say, we have not enacted the Foreign Agents Registry that would require people who receive benefits from a foreign state to declare it publicly, so we would know if they are in fact acting out of conflict of interest and may not be supporting fully the interests of Canada, but also supporting the interests of a hostile foreign power, which would largely be the People's Republic of China.
Mhm. You write strategic reports to our government, and if you were advising the Canadian government right now, what concrete policy or diplomatic moves would you suggest to Canadian diplomats to maintain Canadian value and the credibility and the Canadian interests, including security and economic interests?
Well, I don't think we should make concessions to Chinese economic leverage. Chinese government wants us to remove the 100% tariff on the electric vehicles that China produces. These vehicles have very high state subsidies. So if they were allowed to compete in our market, then our Southern Ontario auto industry moving into electric vehicles would be devastated. But from my point of view,
Yeah.
more seriously, those vehicles have a significant espionage benefit to the Chinese regime because they gather so much information in their operation and also are subject to software updates which would allow the Chinese government to disable them in time of conflict if there's a war over Taiwan, for example. Um, it's similar to our concerns over the Huawei 5G that after considerable resistance, the government finally decided was too endangering to our security to allow to be installed in our telecommunication system, or the NUCTEC scanners that originally, the government had purchased at a significantly low price to be installed in every Canadian embassy and consulate around the world. That eventually the decision was reversed when it was established that those scanners would be sending data back to their manufacturer in China for onward transmission, I'm sure, to the Chinese intelligence services. So giving into that would be a mistake, but we do see very strong indications that the Chinese government plans to, I'm sorry, the Canadian government plans to compromise on the EVs, the electric vehicles issue, in return for the Chinese allowing our Canadian canola products to continue to resume having market in China. I think this would be a grave mistake. So my
Yeah.
advice to the Canadian government would be that we shouldn't accept Chinese conditions for trade. If China wants to do trade with us and accept our agricultural commodities or energy products like natural gas, then it should be without attaching political conditions. And certainly we should be very careful about what Chinese products we allow to enter the Canadian market, and also with regard to technology transfer. We really don't want to strengthen the Chinese military through Canadian produced technology if we're facing a situation where we may be at war with China over South China Sea or Taiwan. If it comes to that, which it is increasingly looking likely by any kind of objective measures. So and also I think that we should expel a significant proportion of the Chinese diplomats in Canada who exceed the cohort required for normal diplomatic engagement. Chinese have something like 4 times the number of diplomats in our country than the Japanese. There's really no justification for having so many diplomats here, and we certainly don't have reciprocal numbers of diplomats in China. So why do we allow the Chinese to send security agents and people who are menacing and intimidating persons with connections to the People's Republic of China in Canada? Why on earth did we allow them to have so many diplomats here, and why do we allow them to operate more or less unhindered because we don't want to impact on our trade relations with China in retaliation for necessary expulsions?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Burton. That's very insightful information, and hope to see you again soon.
Been a great pleasure. Look forward to talking more.
Thank you.